Tam from howtodrawalike.com and welcome back to part 2 of how to draw a dog in a photorealistic style. Part 2 shows the stages the drawing takes but primarily focuses on how to shade fur. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, you can find it on my YouTube channel, or you can find the video on my website www.howtodrawalike.com. Let's get shading! The first part of the drawing that I began shading was the eye. I'm not going to go into too much detail right now about how to shade the eyes, as this is something I'm going to cover in another part of the video series. But I've included it as I want you to see how the drawing took shape from start to finish. The artist pencils pictured now and at the beginning of the video are the exact shades that I used to create the drawing with. I also used the same graphite pencil that I drew the outline with for some of the shading too. Jake, the subject of the drawing, has two main kinds of fur. He's got a soft, short, silky kind of fur across his forehead and around by the muzzle area and also on his paws. And then he's got a longer, coarser fur across his cheeks and his eyebrows. Let's take a look at how to shade the short, silky kind of fur first. The first step to creating the silky kind of fur is to build up a base layer, and do this quite loosely with just a black and a grey artist pencil. You can see in this image here that I've selected an area above the eye and I've used lines probably about the size of a centimetre in both the black and the grey across this area. And what I've done is I've tried to look at the original photograph again that I'm working from, and I've tried to pick out the areas that are darkest, and I've highlighted those a little bit more using the black, and then the slightly lighter areas that are kind of a dark grey I've highlighted initially just using the grey, and I've used just very rough pencil strokes for this, so you can see a lot of the brown background is still showing through. To give the fur a strong, realistic appearance, I've repeated the same process a number of times to build up the fur effect. But as I've added more layers, I've used smaller strokes each time, so that you see less and less of the brown background showing through. Once happy with the density of the fur, I put on another final layer, using just very small strokes this time, about 1 to 2 millimeters long, but really focused on what areas should be darker and what areas are slightly lighter. So you can see by the left hand side of the eye towards the left of the edge of the head, I've used very fine black strokes with just a couple of grey strokes mixed in with that. Whereas if you look above that, you can see I've used significantly more grey strokes with just a few black ones to break up that, so it's not just a big block of colour. Then to finish it off, I've used the white artist pencil to put little flecks of white throughout the whole patch of the fur, and this gives slight highlights to every kind of strand and gives the fur a less flat look and just finishes it off. If you're not feeling too confident about trying this technique out on your drawing straight away, perhaps practice on a bit of paper first, so just draw out a basic circle or square or standard shape, and then try and experiment with this style of shading and just building up the layers and putting in small highlights and shadows to create that realistic fur effect. This stage of the drawing starts to incorporate some of that longer, coarser fur I mentioned earlier in the video. You can see in this image I've put a little bit more shading in around the eye, and again I will discuss this in a future part of the video series. We're just going to have a look at the coarse fur for now. When dealing with light and dark colours, it's important to make sure that any light colours are blocked in first, as it's much more difficult to go over a darker colour with a lighter colour once you've put that in. So you can see I did it with the eyebrow in the beginning. I blocked that in with the white strands of fur, and I've also done it now with the cheek fur, and I've put in some rough lines just loosely marking out the shape of this patch that is in this white colour, and I've also mixed in some loose grey strands with that too. When shading the short fur, it's quite easy to control the length of the fur, the direction of the fur, because it's very small strokes, so it's easy to choose that starting and stopping point. But with the longer fur, it's a little bit more challenging, and it can often look a little bit messy if you do start a long strand of fur and then you've got to stop halfway through it to readjust your hand or your wrist and then continue that long stroke on. So one of the main tips I can give you for drawing the long strands is to have a look at where you want the starting point of the stroke to be, and then have a look at where you want the finishing point to be, and then use, depending if you're right or left-handed, but use whichever hand you don't draw with, use your finger to mark out roughly where you want that strand of fur to finish, because that gives you a really good strong stopping point then to aim for, and then try and give yourself the freedom of movement to get your starting point and get that long stroke continually going from one to the other without putting a break in the middle, because this will give you a much more realistic line to work with rather than a broken up one. If you again don't feel too comfortable doing that on a first attempt, practice on a bit of paper. That's easily done with just some plain paper and a standard pencil you can use for it, and just choose a stopping point and just try and get a nice steady flowing line, and practice the shapes of the line as well, because you don't always want a plain straight line, you want sometimes a bit of a curve on it or a bigger curve sometimes, and just spend 10 minutes or so practicing that first before you apply it to your drawing. After putting in these white lines, I've added some finer black lines nearer the top that lead into the white lines of the fur, and I've also added some black and some grey in between the white fur a bit more, so that's given it a bit more depth. You haven't just got the brown background showing through again, and it's just a case of, similarly to the first fur technique, the short fur, it's just the same kind of process. It's just building up layers, but instead of using smaller strokes of a centimetre or smaller, it's using longer ones, and most of them are sort of about an inch or so long at this point, just to build up the layers. But be careful to make sure you've got a lot of strong white showing through if that's the colouring you're using for your drawing, because it's easy at this stage to lose some of that white to a bit of a muddy grey black colour. If you use a bit too much black and grey, the white can get lost. At this point I also sharpen the white artist pencil again, so that there's a really nice strong tip of the pencil on the end, as after doing the eyebrow and that bit of cheek, the nib's got a bit worn down on it, and what that allows me to do is put in some very fine, sharp, bright white lines over the top of some of the less powerful white lines, and that again gives the fur a more 3D look rather than a flat look. So I definitely recommend doing that at multiple stages throughout this drawing, is to sharpen all of your pencils quite frequently so that you've always got a thin, sharp line at the ready, and you don't get this flat, less strong range of tone, which is what starts to happen once the nib of a pencil gets a bit worn down. You might have noticed at this point the fur on the forehead has changed again. It's got a little bit more of a white fleck running through it, and a little bit more of a highlight in certain places. And what led me to this change was putting in the black fur on the left of the head there. Once I put that in contrast, the fur on the forehead looked still like there was a bit too much brown showing through, and it didn't look quite dense enough to me, so I went back over again the top with another layer. Exactly the same process I mentioned before, putting small lines of black and grey and then white over the top to add some highlights. The dark patch of fur to the left, which is in the shadows, followed exactly the same process as the fur on the forehead. It was just mainly made up of just black and grey strokes, and only a couple of grey ones, as there were a couple of strands of fur that were showing through and seemed to have a little bit of a grey highlight to them, and also along the left edge there was a little bit of light touching the side of the head there, so that's been highlighted in grey, but it's exactly the same, just again smallish strokes, not quite as little as the ones on the forehead and not quite as long as the ones on the coarse fur on the cheek, just repeated over and over again over the patch to build up that dark tone. I also used the graphite pencil that I drew the outline with to go over some of the black as well, just to give it a bit of a darker tone again, and also it helped to fill some of those brown gaps that were just peeking through the individual strands of fur on that patch. So that's something you can do too if you do need to darken up some little gaps where you've got the paper showing through. Is just put a very thin layer of graphite over the top of that, and that will take the edge off of those areas. This stage of the drawing shows more of the longer coarser fur being added in, and it's exactly the same process as the longer coarser fur next to it, the whiter bit on the cheek there, just with a bit more black, so more black strands being put in and less white. And it's a little bit trickier to do this way round because you've got to be careful to leave enough room for the white if you haven't put enough in initially. So it's a very good idea to start off with very pale strokes and then build on top of them, so really light lines, so then if you do realise you should have put a bit more white in places, you can still add it over the top of the black and you're not going to get a completely grey muddy tone. The fur on the paw isn't quite as sleek as the fur on the forehead of Jake, but it's in no way coarse either. It's still quite short and fine, so it again follows a similar pattern to the fur on the forehead, but I've used a slightly different technique for this one. And what I've done to start off with is I've really blocked the colour in this time, so I've put quite big patches of black in and patches of grey where the dark and where the slightly lighter areas are on the paw, but it's quite rough at this stage, and you'll see it does end up being adjusted somewhat as the paw progresses. Now, although I've put quite big patches of colour in at this stage, be careful when you're doing this yourself to not press too hard. As you can see there, I haven't pressed too hard. It's enough, to be able to see it and for it to show through any colour I put on top to some extent, but it's not to the point where you can't work over the top of it again. So you want quite a light layer to start off with. I've refined the areas of black and grey a bit more at this point here. You can see I've still used the same kind of blocking technique as in the previous image. I've also added in some of the brighter highlights now as well, so you can see some patches of white near the sort of the cheek of Jake on the paw, and also down near the end of the paw there as well, so that those areas don't get too lost to black or darker shades. This is a bit of a close-up of the paw, and you can see in the top left corner how I've started to put small vertical white lines going over that grey patch that I blocked in. So this is where that same technique that I used on the forehead fur is coming into play now, so starting to build up small strokes over the top of the base colour that I put in to begin with. I've continued the technique further at this stage of the drawing, so you can see the paw is kind of half shaded in now, and I've followed the same pattern as the previous image showed, so small lines, and it's important to make sure these lines travel in the same direction that the fur does from the reference photo that you're using as well, because that can cause a lot of problems if the fur is not following the right direction or it's chopping and changing all over the place. So it's important to make sure that you keep continuity with the direction of the fur unless it deviates in the actual image. What I've done in some of the areas where the fur is that bit lighter, it's difficult to create a realistic look there with just the grey and the white artist pencils that I've been using. So I've used that graphite pencil that I did the outline with again, and I've just put a very light layer over the grey and the white areas just to darken them up a bit, but not to the same extent so that it gets lost and blends in too much with the black. And just to clarify, that's a smooth full covering with the graphite pencil, not the small lines that I've been using for the fur technique. So just a normal even covering, the way you just shade something regularly over the top of the white areas just to darken them up a little bit and take the edge off the white. This is just a close-up again to give you a better idea of the kind of marks that I'm making and hopefully give you a bit of a clearer view of the way the layers start to build up using these small strokes to create that fur effect. I've continued the same technique further down the paw, and you can see I've brought in a couple of lighter patches further down as well. So again, it's important to forward plan for these because you don't want to put too much black in those areas because then you won't get the same light tones that you actually need. They'll be that bit darker because of the black showing through underneath. So forward planning is always important. To do the fur in this style, it's quite a time-consuming process. This paw from start to finish took around 2 to 3 hours to shade in, so that's quite a long time just for one small area, but it's definitely worth it in the long run because you get a really nice looking drawing and a really well shaded picture at the end of it. So definitely persevere. If you're starting to feel a bit fed up part of the way through, you can always take a break for a little bit and then go back to it with a bit more of a refreshed outlook. So I've put the white bits that are at the end of Jake's paws in now at this point, and this is where my pencil sharpening tip comes in handy also, because near the end of Jake's paw before the black meets the white there's quite a few random single white hairs dotted about, and it's very difficult to leave the space for these before this stage. So what you need to do at this point is go over the top of the black with the white pencil. If you use a slightly blunter one, you probably would lose those white lines or they'd end up looking quite grey, but with a freshly sharpened pencil it's just enough in a couple of places to get a very sharp white line still showing through to give us those little wispy white hairs. Here I've added in some more of the longer coarser fur, and I probably should have noted near the beginning of this part of the video, it doesn't matter exactly where you start with the shading on a drawing, but it's important to consider smudging as a factor. So I've intentionally started near the top left hand side so that I can work my way down the left side and then start near the top right and work my way down that side to try and avoid smudging the drawing too much. If I started over the right side and then tried to do bits to the left, my right arm would be moving over that side quite frequently and it would be at risk of smudging. So take that into consideration when shading in your own drawings. Again, I've done a bit more forward planning here and I've put in some of the white next to the sort of cheek running down towards the nose, so that I'm able then to put some of this black blocked in shading beneath it. If I'd done it the other way round, then it would be harder to put those white stray strands of fur that are going over the top in after, and there's quite a few of these that cross over that other paw so it could look a bit grey and messy if I didn't do that first. And then you can see I've blocked in some black and grey and white tones on that pool, the same as I did the first one. At this stage the claws appear in the drawing and they're quite simple to shade in. I just applied an even grey tone to begin with, and then against the right hand edge I've added a bit of shadow in using black and graphite pencil, and then about a third of the way in from the left hand side I've put a bit of a highlight, and then right on the left edge then it gets slightly darker. It's a little bit difficult to see in this image here, just to give them a general smooth shiny effect. And to finish off this part of the video, I've just filled in some more of the coarser, longer fur beneath the cheek there above the second paw. This concludes how to shade fur. The next part of the video series will be looking at how to shade the eyes. I try to leave a little bit of a gap in between uploading each part of this series to YouTube, just to allow some time for you to take in what the videos cover and then put that into practice. So part 3 will be available shortly. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you have any questions about anything that I've covered in parts 1 or parts 2 so far, or any general questions about art and drawing, please do get in contact. You can visit my website at www.howtodrawlike.com and go to the contact page there to send me a message, or you can contact me directly through Twitter. You go to @howtodrawlike on Twitter. You can follow me there and also have direct conversations with me. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel too, Tam How to Draw Like, so you can stay up to date with any future content that I bring out. See you back again soon for another video. Thanks for watching and bye for now.